quickly summarizing, we've talked coupling and loose coupling. I hope you've gotten to the conclusion that coupling is something that has more elements to it. The incoming and the outgoing coupling, the temporal platform spatial coupling, and that different components will likely have a different type of coupling signature or map or whatever you want to call this sort of diagram. Spider graph is also another name for it, where sometimes there are trade-offs. So for example, if I want to do pub-sub in order to reduce temporal coupling, that may require me, depending on my environment, to take a higher level of platform coupling to say, oh, okay, I'm going to use a queuing system like RabbitMQ. And RabbitMQ, fantastic queuing system, supports AMQP. Unfortunately, it only supports AMQP 0.9, and AMQP 1.0 is not backwards compatible with AMQP 0.9, so you have interoperability concerns there. So you might be taking some platform coupling by choosing a queuing system. Or you might say, I'm going to do everything with SMTP. In which case, say, well, what does that do to my spatial coupling if I'm talking about things that are geographically distributed? That can bring down my spatial coupling, because now not everything needs to go through a single server. So there's all sorts of trade-offs that happens around technological choices that influence a lot of these system aspects of coupling. But the important thing that I want to drive home more and more, try to have those decisions decoupled from the logical relationships between your pieces of code. Try to keep the logic away from all of those other system aspects, like we said with regards to the document-centric messaging over here. All right? So coupling, it's not something that you can really say it's either loose or tight, but rather you can say, is the coupling for this component reasonable for its responsibility? Where I could say for a front-end web API type component, platform coupling is something that I'd really want to keep low. Even if that means I have to do HTTP request response, which is going to result in a higher amount of temporal coupling. And that makes perfect sense for web API type stuff that's handling queries. If I'm talking about an internal component that's doing pub-sub, I'd prefer lower temporal coupling even at a cost of higher platform coupling. So there's never going to be this, oh, this is loosely coupled or tightly coupled, but try to analyze the component's responsibility and say, does it make sense? All right? Questions? Yes?
I want to come back to the document-based messaging
Right?
kind of approach.
Mm-hmm.
So I've once seen a presentation, I think, by Greg Young,
Mm-hmm.
who did a session on document-based messaging, and he said it was a great way if you would basically pass around the document and basically enrich it each time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got those kinds of systems where you basically send around a document and you enrich it and then use the routing slips to basically determine what the next thing that should handle this document is based on your internal logic.
Right.
Wouldn't you say that is fair usage of that particular type of messaging, or would you say
Right.
you could do the exact same thing using a process manager?
Right. Okay. So when talking about the document-centric messaging, and as you framed the question of saying, usually there is a sequence of steps that happens where that document message gets enriched by various other parties over time, and a lot of times one of the reason why document-centric messaging can appear attractive is that because the document contains everything about itself, then we can use that for the purposes of routing without having to talk to some central resource like, as you framed it, a process manager. Now, from a purely distributed computing perspective, the document-centric model has certain benefits in the sense that we don't require a central point to return to in order to decide how this thing needs to be routed going forwards. And I can understand where Greg's coming from, as you mentioned in your question. Greg Young, big proponent of CQRS and highly scalable, high throughput systems. The strength of document-centric messaging in those contexts, I'd say that when the complexity of the business logic is relatively low and the type of enrichment that you're doing is relatively simple, and the main objective is high throughput and low latency, then there's an advantage to that pattern. However, as the complexity of the logic and the enrichment increases, and that influences how things get routed more and more, and you get more parties that are involved, first of all, the message starts to get quite a bit bigger, and that tends to weigh more and more heavily on the queuing system and its ability to move that message from one place to another. So in general, there's no free lunch, all right? So the more data that you're moving around, that's going to have a cost. That's the bandwidth side of things and latency, right? The more data that you're moving, the more TCP packets need to be moved across the network. That's going to hurt. And again, that's a concern with a document-centric pattern, is that while in V1 you might only be moving, I don't know, 50 kilobytes of data around, from what I've seen of document-centric systems is that that center of gravity kind of becomes a black hole. And that developers, anytime that additional data needs to be made available, like, well, we've already got this message, let's just piggyback that on there. And it starts to get heavier and heavier, both in terms of the physical weight and its impact on the queuing system, as well as the logical coupling that happens to go through it. So in essence, you end up with effectively one gigantic class that lots and lots of things take a dependency on. And as we know, that starts to become problematic. As we mentioned, let's go back here, this one, okay? So if the incoming coupling grows, that can be fine so long as it is very stable, right? The problem with something like a document-centric message is that it's modeling a lot of volatile business concepts. So it tends to be not very stable. And as it starts to change, all of the things that took dependencies on it are more likely to break. So its strength in terms of the throughput and the latency and those types of performance characteristics of a distributed system are paid for by a higher amount of logical coupling and reduced maintainability. And in different environments, that trade-off might make sense. So like I said, if the enrichment is relatively simple and straightforward and the data structure size is more stable, then you should be in pretty good, in an environment where document-centric messaging is not going to, on average, hurt you. For most business systems that I've seen that have used document-centric messaging, oftentimes it was human workflow. It's not something that needed to be extremely high throughput and low latency. Oftentimes, the data model of this thing was quite volatile, and more stuff started to get tacked onto it, and the maintainability costs started to really add up quickly. So in that case, I'd say I disagree with Greg's statement as a baseline statement. I'd say this pattern should be avoided for most business systems, except where these exceptions occur, rather than the way that Greg framed it, which is, this is an awesome pattern, use it. All right? Does that kind of help anchor the differences in points of view?
Yes, I think so.
All right, great.
I didn't think Greg said use it only when appropriate, of course.
Well, everybody says that. It's this is totally awesome, small asterisk at the bottom, use only where appropriate. All right? Yeah.
If you do document-centric and do enrichment, you've got to go through steps A, B, C, D to enrich the document.
Mm-hmm.
If you break it up into 4 separate message queues, would you say each one gets individually enriched in some way, how do you know when the last one's done and it's ready to go?
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't know it in the document-centric. You pass it on to the next queue, pass it on to the next queue.
Right.
It's hit that queue, ready to actually action it and process it.
Right.
The document's ready. But because it's now broken up into, say, 4 separate pieces,
Right.
out of order.
Right.
How do you know when to say it's ready to go?
Right. So, as you mentioned, the strength of document-centric messaging is, I'd say, its simplicity. It's the fact that the same message is going from point A to point B to C to D, and then you know it arrives at D, that's it, I'm done. Whereas if instead of having one big gigantic message, I have 4 smaller messages that are more specific, how do I know when I'm done? In essence, and we're not entirely, well, we haven't yet started our discussion about messaging patterns and definitely haven't gotten into process managers. In essence, the difference in approach is to say those responsibilities should be more explicitly mapped out. And going back to our pub/sub discussion from before, these are the types of questions that we should be asking in terms of the boundaries, even before we get into routing, all right? Of saying, am I even allowed to do pub/sub there? Is that really a message that I want to be using that is going to be going between boundary A and B? Or should there be boundary X and Y, in which case it's a totally different set of messages? So in some ways, it's sort of a false dichotomy of saying, isn't this better with document-centric messaging? But rather to say, well, there's a whole other set of logical design questions that we should be asking before we get into that conversation of how am I going to know whether a given workflow is done. First, let's start there, map that out, figure that out, regardless of messaging. And then from there, we'll look at, great, which messages, if any, will we be using, and which other patterns will we be using in concert with these types of service boundaries? Right. Sagas, UI composition, things that we'll talk about later on in this course, to say, document-centric messaging is a somewhat monolithic solution to all of those problems, which makes it better for some things and weaker in some other ways. Personally, I find that for complex problem domains, I like to spend some time carving them up at a purely logical level before getting into where am I going to be using messaging, am I going to be using process managers, routing slips, UI composition, domain models, and all of those other techniques. All right? So I'd say that's the distinction. It's premature to have the why not use document-centric for everything discussion. All right? So we'll get to that. Bear with me. I know that it's like, but I've done N-Service Bus and I know this stuff and I've run into this problem and how do I solve that? I got to tell you, a lot of this stuff is going to be solved by having good, solid service boundaries.